Whispers filled the royal halls that day, but nobody expected it would be the youngest royal who'd command the room. In a family known for secrets, silence, and seniority, Princess Charlotte's voice shattered a century-old code and left Camilla frozen in place. The corridors of Windsor Castle had echoed with power plays and protocol for generations, but on this particular morning, something far more fragile was cracking beneath the polished surface. King Charles had summoned the family to what aides referred to as a closed-doors clarity summit, though no one truly expected clarity to emerge from a gathering where buried tensions had long been left to rot in silence. A growing unrest had been bubbling through the royal inner circle. Too many whispered frustrations, too many eyes turning away, and too many decisions being made behind layers of tradition no one dared to challenge until now. Camilla entered the chamber with hurried steps, already flustered. Her grip on the folds of her gown was unusually tight, her nods to the others quick and unsteady. She scanned the room, her eyes pausing briefly when they met Charlotte's, who was seated beside her mother, unusually upright, her hands folded in her lap. The contrast was striking. While Camilla radiated the energy of someone ready to defend her crown, Charlotte sat in a silence so composed, it felt ancient. The king's announcement was brief but heavy. "This meeting," he declared, "is to address a matter of direction, of harmony or the lack thereof." His words sounded rehearsed, perhaps even softened, but his tone betrayed an underlying plea. He wasn't speaking as a monarch, but as a father on the edge of losing control. The room was tense from the start. William's shoulders were stiff, his jaw locked. Catherine's eyes never left her daughter. Harry's absence was noted but not acknowledged. And in the background, Camilla's presence seemed both central and disruptive, her mere existence casting a long shadow over the legacy of the women who came before her. As discussions began, the temperature in the room dropped. Voices were low but sharp discussions of public perception, of who should be seen and not heard, of which roles belonged to whom. Camilla defended her position with pointed grace, reminding the room of the work I've done, the loyalty I've shown. Anne, calm but curt, questioned the definition of loyalty. Tensions between the older generation and the future heirs were no longer veiled. They were laid bare, bitter and raw. Suddenly, Charles raised a hand. "Enough," he muttered, though no one had truly started shouting. The silence that followed was cold, almost rehearsed. And in that silence, something happened that no one had expected, not even those closest to her. Charlotte, who had remained a silent observer through it all, quietly stood. She didn't look to her mother for permission. She didn't seek her father's nod. She simply rose, and with a calm voice that seemed far too steady for her years, she said, "I have something to say." Heads turned, eyes widened. Even Camilla froze. For a moment, it was as if time held its breath. What came out of Charlotte's mouth next didn't just silence the room, it triggered a reckoning Camilla never saw coming. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Yet with just a few carefully chosen words, Charlotte pierced the very core of Camilla's reign and the monarchy's unspoken wounds. The silence that followed Charlotte's declaration was not ordinary. It was dense, like fog, and heavy with history. The phrase she had just delivered, "You were never supposed to wear that crown," was not a child's rebellion, but a reckoning. The air shifted. Camilla's smile, already strained, faded into something more brittle. Her fingers, almost instinctively, moved to her brooch, as if clinging to some tangible sense of identity, something to anchor her in the room that had just turned cold. Charlotte stood still, her chin high, her voice steady. "I heard the Queen once say, privately, that it should have been my grandmother who wore the crown beside grandfather," she continued. Her eyes flickered toward her father for the briefest moment. And that if things had been different, the people would have seen a queen with grace, not just with a title. The weight of the implication was not lost on anyone. Diana's name hadn't been spoken, but it didn't need to be. It was etched into the walls, sewn into the carpet, haunting the very silence between sentences. Camilla looked to Charles for support, but the king was frozen in place, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the table. Catherine's expression was unreadable, but her lips pressed into a faint line, and her eyes glistened not with sadness, but something else. Pride, perhaps. Pain, definitely. William leaned forward slightly, as if caught between stopping his daughter and standing with her. But he didn't move. No one did. Charlotte stepped forward at a single pace. Her voice didn't rise, but it hardened. "You said children should know their place," she said, directing her gaze fully at Camilla now. "But this is my place. This is my family too. And some truths shouldn't be buried just because they're inconvenient." Camilla opened her mouth, desperate to regain control of the moment, perhaps to reduce this to a childish outburst. "Darling, you're misunderstanding," she began, but Charlotte cut through her with a precision that felt years beyond her age. "No, I'm remembering." Her tone was final. The room remained still, as if nobody dared breathe. It wasn't just the words that hit, it was the clarity behind them. The way they dismantled the carefully constructed illusion of unity. The way they evoked a legacy that had been rewritten to accommodate someone who was never meant to be at the center of the story. Charlotte wasn't asking questions, she was delivering statements. And in doing so, she made it clear that the next generation wasn't content to play by the same unspoken rules. Her speech wasn't rehearsed. It came from a deeper place, an instinct, a pulse of inherited truth. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a reclamation. But how did Charlotte come to speak with such clarity and confidence? The answer lies in the weeks leading up to this explosive moment. What if Charlotte wasn't acting alone? Behind the scenes, someone had been quietly preparing her for this day, and it wasn't Catherine or William. In the weeks leading up to that fateful meeting, a different rhythm had begun to echo through the quieter corners of the royal estate. It wasn't marked by fanfare or headlines, but by something far more deliberate. Quiet conversations held behind closed doors, subtle glances exchanged in empty hallways, and strolls through the gardens that ended in whispered truths. It was during these moments that Princess Anne began meeting privately with Charlotte, not as a formal royal engagement, but as a passing of something sacred. A legacy not written in gold, but in grit. Their walks began as routine, disguised under the banner of family bonding. But beneath the surface, Anne had sensed a shift. She saw something in Charlotte, an intuition, a readiness. Where others saw a polite young girl, Anne recognized a spirit forged by watching contradiction after contradiction play out within palace walls. Camilla's growing presence, Catherine's silent strength, William's caution, and above all, the lingering absence of Diana, who had never truly left the conversation. No matter how much the firm tried to erase her footprints, over tea, Anne spoke carefully. She didn't dump the scandal. She offered perspective. She painted portraits of Diana not as a martyr, but as a woman who had dared to challenge a system with only truth and empathy as her weapons. She spoke of how Diana's legacy had been softened over time, folded neatly into the crown's story to make it palatable, sanitized. But her power, Anne told Charlotte, wasn't in what they remembered. It was what they feared. Her voice. Anne then turned that mirror on Camilla, not with venom, but with clarity. She explained how power could take many shapes, sometimes loud, sometimes cunning, often cloaked in humility. She warned Charlotte of how influence could be disguised as grace, and how silence could be just another form of control. "You must learn to read the quiet," Anne had said, "because that's where truth hides in this family." In one of their last walks before the gathering, Anne paused beneath a withered tree near the Queen's favorite bench. She didn't make a speech. She simply placed her hand gently on Charlotte's shoulder and said, "There will come a moment when everything inside you will want to remain silent. Don't speak. Don't whisper. Not like we did." And that was it. A quiet mentorship. Not rehearsed, not orchestrated, but born from the recognition of potential and the burden of unfinished legacies. Charlotte didn't walk into that family meeting as a child who had something to say. She walked in as the one person prepared to say what others wouldn't. The youngest royal had become the boldest voice. And now, the walls that once silenced truth were beginning to crack. But there was more behind Charlotte's words than just influence. There was a story hidden deep within the walls of Windsor. Tucked beneath velvet and gold, a single folded letter forgotten by many, but never by Charlotte, revealed a dying queen's private wish and an unfulfilled promise. It wasn't meant to be found that day. Charlotte had simply followed her mother into the royal dressing chamber, curious as Catherine prepared for a formal engagement. The jewelry vault had always held a certain mystique, a sacred place filled with history, symbolism, and whispered rules about what belonged to whom. But as Catherine sifted through the ornate cases, searching for a specific brooch once favored by Queen Elizabeth, her hand paused on a compartment she hadn't opened in years. That's when Charlotte saw it. A small, faded envelope tucked behind a velvet lining, sealed not with wax but with a royal crest pressed into the paper itself. Charlotte reached for it before Catherine could react. What happened next would not just shape the days that followed it, would define her destiny. The envelope was addressed in Queen Elizabeth's own delicate handwriting, and the words written across its front were chilling in their precision, "To the granddaughter who will reign with grace." At first, Catherine hesitated to open it. But after a moment, she simply handed it to Charlotte. "If it's meant for you," she whispered, "you read it." The letter inside was not long, but it was potent. It spoke of legacy, not in titles, but in values. The Queen wrote of watching Charlotte grow, of sensing the same quiet strength she had once seen in Diana. There was a direct reference to the late Princess of Wales, not by name, but unmistakably. "Some light never fades, no matter how many curtains are drawn. You remind me of that light." So did she. What followed was even more striking. A true queen is not chosen by bloodlines alone, but by the presence she carries. Crowns may be assigned, but reverence is earned. Charlotte read the letter several times that night, absorbing its weight. Catherine never asked her to hide it. But she did say one thing: "When the moment comes, don't let it slip past you." That's what your great-grandmother would have wanted. And so Charlotte kept it, not as a weapon, but as a compass. It didn't give her power, it gave her clarity. A clarity that would one day help her speak not just from instinct, but from truth. When the royal family gathered weeks later, and Charlotte rose to confront the queen consort, it was not rage that guided her. It was this letter. A voice from a monarch now gone, speaking louder than any decree still standing. It gave Charlotte more than courage. It gave her permission. Permission to challenge the way things had always been. Permission to say, "This is not right," and mean it. But Camilla had her own reasons for holding on to power, and a secret she believed would silence any opposition until Charlotte shattered it. Backed into a corner, Camilla didn't retreat, she fought. But what she said next was meant to destroy Charlotte's credibility, and instead exposed a royal deception years in the making. There was a tremble in the room, not of fear, but of fury disguised as civility. Camilla's composure had cracked. The queen consort, so often cloaked in careful words and diplomatic glances, finally stepped out from behind her armor. Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This," she said, gesturing toward Charlotte, "is childish mimicry. Fairy tales spun from resentment, fed by bitter women too afraid to let go of the past. The venom wasn't hidden. It was aimed, pointed, and meant to reduce Charlotte's truth to an emotional outburst shaped by older, envious hands." But Charlotte didn't flinch. It was William who leaned forward first, his voice steady but strained. "If the Queen approved your future, why was it never written? Why was it never shown to us?" Camilla didn't answer right away. Her fingers twitched at her side. Her breath hitched. And then she snapped, not with elegance, but with a fury long withheld. "Because your mother made sure you wouldn't." The room froze. Catherine's expression didn't change, but her silence became thunderous, and in that pause, something irreversible had occurred. Camilla had made it personal. She had crossed a line. King Charles looked away. Anne's eyes narrowed. The hierarchy of silence was collapsing. In an attempt to reclaim authority, Camilla demanded that an aide bring in a folder thick, sealed, and supposedly holding the Queen's personal endorsement. "This," she declared, "contains Her Majesty's final thoughts on the future of the crown." But when the envelope was opened and the documents spread, confusion rippled across the table. The pages were redacted. The signatures are missing. There was no royal crest, no verifiable seal. Just vague language, unverifiable sources, and handwritten notes that lacked authenticity. It wasn't a statement, it was a suggestion. Anne, calm but cold, leaned in and said what everyone else was thinking. "This was never the Queen's final intent. She told me so herself, and she never put ink to paper on anything that didn't come from conviction." Camilla said nothing, because she couldn't. The myth she had built, the idea that Queen Elizabeth had quietly crowned her in spirit, was unraveling before her very eyes. Charlotte didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The silence around her now echoed with validation. What had started as a child's unexpected confrontation had turned into the unmasking of a carefully controlled narrative. A lie that had been guarded for years had finally collapsed under its own weight. As Camilla's narrative crumbled, the power dynamics in the room shifted, and Charlotte stood taller than ever. It wasn't just Charlotte who found her voice that day. Prince William, long bound by diplomacy and duty, finally chose between silence and truth. The room was still reeling from Camilla's unraveling defense when William stood. For a moment, his hands trembled slightly at his sides, the weight of decades pressing down on his spine. He wasn't just a prince at that moment, he was a son, a father, and a man standing at the crossroads between loyalty and legacy. His voice was low at first, cracking with restraint. "The spirit of this family," he began, "lives in her more than in any of us." All eyes turned to Charlotte. His words weren't flattery, they were confessions. A long overdue acknowledgement that the youngest among them had carried a truth the rest had buried beneath protocol and self-preservation. William's gaze didn't wander. He looked directly at Camilla, his expression steady but unflinching. "There was a time when I believed in the idea of healing this family, of giving second chances," he said, voice tightening. "But what I've seen, what we've all seen, is that some wounds don't close when truth is denied. They rot." He didn't name names. He didn't need to. His accusation was surgical. The implication was clear: Camilla's presence had not united the family. It had deepened the fracture. Then, with a sigh that seemed to draw from years of restraint, William turned toward his daughter and knelt slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. "You've earned your voice in this room," he said quietly, holding her hand. "You've earned something most of us were never brave enough to ask for to be heard." The power of that moment didn't come from theatrics. It came from the sheer rarity of honesty within those walls. Catherine, who had remained composed throughout the confrontation, now moved with a quiet certainty. She placed her hand gently atop the leather folder that held Queen Elizabeth's hidden will, the same one Charlotte had carried for weeks. No words passed between them, but her eyes met Anne's, and the nod exchanged between the two women said everything. This wasn't a coup. This was a correction. A reclaiming of a narrative that had long been twisted. No one else in the room spoke. Even Camilla, now sitting in stunned silence, seemed to sense the tide had turned. The carefully orchestrated roles and titles had slipped out of relevance. What remained were truths too heavy to ignore and alliances too visible to suppress. William's choice wasn't just emotional, it was historic. In siding with his daughter, he shattered the notion that rank alone determined one's place in the royal conversation. The monarchy, for a brief and fragile moment, felt human again. Vulnerable, exposed, and real. But what about King Charles? His reaction was the final piece, and the most heartbreaking of all. The king's composure cracked. For the first time since his reign began, he revealed the regret that's haunted him since Diana's funeral, and why Charlotte's words felt like a ghost returning. Charles sat motionless as the weight of the room pressed down on him. The man who had spent a lifetime mastering restraint, who had endured scandal, scrutiny, and succession, suddenly looked not like a monarch, but like a man unraveling. He didn't speak immediately. His eyes, glassy and fixed, stared past the room as if trying to escape it. And then, almost inaudibly, he whispered the words no one expected to hear. "She speaks like her." The silence deepened. Everyone knew who he meant. Diana wasn't in the room, but her presence had never left. And now, through Charlotte's voice, she had returned not as a memory, but as a reckoning. Charles's voice trembled as he continued, no longer trying to conceal the truth he had buried beneath decades of protocol and regret. "I thought, if I made Camilla queen, maybe I could rewrite the story, fix what I broke, give it all new meaning." He paused, the confession catching in his throat. "But I didn't fix anything. I just replaced what I couldn't face." He turned toward William, and then slowly to Charlotte, his expression hollowed by the enormity of what he was finally admitting. "I feared what you both stood for. Diana's legacy. It haunted me. Not because it was untrue, but because I didn't know how to live in its shadow. You became the reminder, and I thought if I silenced that reminder long enough, the past would fade." His words landed like thunder. Every royal in the room had suspected fragments of this truth, but never had it been spoken aloud. The very idea that Charles had advanced Camilla not simply for love or duty, but as a way to suppress the legacy of the woman he couldn't forget, was devastating. And in admitting it, he stripped himself of the image the palace had carefully crafted for years. He glanced at Camilla then, not coldly, but with a devastating clarity. "Maybe," he said softly, "the crown should skip us both." The room froze. No one moved. It was not an abdication. It was something far more damning. A king confessing that the crown he wore no longer felt like destiny but a debt. And that debt had come calling in the form of a young girl with her grandmother's fire in her voice. No one interrupted him. Not Anne, not William, not even Camilla, who looked away, her silence a shield of her own. Charles had finally said what the monarchy had feared to admit for years, that power obtained without peace was a hollow throne. What happened after this emotional collapse wasn't expected, but it marked a new royal order few saw coming. Out of broken bonds and shattered lies, a new agreement was forged quietly, but with seismic consequences. And Camilla was no longer part of it. The collapse of King Charles's composure had torn open a fault line that could no longer be ignored. That night, behind tightly closed doors, a small gathering took place in a private study deep within Windsor. There was no staff present, no photographers, no royal advisors, just four figures bound by blood, trust, and now, an unspoken urgency. Anne, William, and Catherine sat with the king not as subordinates, but as equal architects of what would soon be called the modern royal pact. The air was thick with the aftermath of confession. Charles, still visibly shaken, listened more than he spoke. Anne was the first to suggest the shift, not in tone, but in structure. Camilla, she said, could retain her ceremonial title. But from this point forward, she would hold no executive influence. Her role would be entirely symbolic, stripped of any power to interfere with public policy, royal protocol, or succession planning. The monarchy needed to restore trust, and it could no longer afford to confuse personal comfort with national legacy. William supported the idea without hesitation. For him, this wasn't punishment, it was protection of the institution, of the future, and of his children. And then, Catherine spoke, her words as precise as they were transformative. If the public is looking for a reason to believe again, let them see the future now. Let them see Charlotte. It wasn't a demand. It was a revelation. The monarchy didn't need another queen with a crown. It needed a voice that could rise from the silence of the past and speak to the soul of the nation. Charlotte would not be crowned tomorrow, but she would begin, groomed quietly for diplomatic leadership, prepared for a future that blended tradition with empathy. She wouldn't be forced into the mold of her predecessors. She would define her own, and in doing so, redefine the monarchy. Camilla, informed the next morning with no room for negotiation, didn't object. Not because she agreed, but because she understood. The narrative had already left her behind. Her influence, once meticulously cultivated, had evaporated in a single night of reckoning. Effective immediately, she would step away from all high-profile duties. The palace's official statement was careful, measured. A generational transition is underway, reflective of evolving priorities within the royal household. And while the nation digested the language, Charlotte stood alone on a balcony above the gardens, watching the morning sun rise over Windsor. Calm, composed, unknowingly iconic, she didn't yet understand the gravity of what had unfolded. But history had already taken her hand. But the world didn't know what had truly happened until one royal photo changed everything. No press release, no speech, just one photograph of Charlotte in white, standing before the gates of Windsor, captured a truth the monarchy couldn't deny. The image appeared without fanfare, no royal crest stamped beside it, no caption loaded with formality. Just one frame, released quietly on the palace's official account in the early hours of dawn. But within moments, it ignited a movement. Charlotte stood alone, her posture dignified yet untouched by rigidity. In her hands, she held the same weathered folder once used to safeguard Queen Elizabeth's private letter, now a symbol that had transcended generations and shattered centuries of curated silence. It was the final, unmistakable confirmation that the tide had turned, not just within the royal family, but in the hearts of the public. Camilla's absence from all subsequent engagements became louder than any denial. Her name was suddenly missing from event rosters. Her image, once prominently displayed beside the king, had been relegated to background formality. In press circles, whispers became headlines. In homes, speculation became certainty. Charlotte hadn't just spoken her truth, she had become the embodiment of it. And in doing so, she'd exposed everything that had festered behind velvet curtains and closed doors. The photograph sparked a cultural aftershock. Across social media, across dinner tables, across generations, Bravo Charlotte trended with unprecedented force. Not because she was royal, but because she had done what so many in power never could. She told the truth unfiltered, unscripted, and unafraid. And in her honesty, people saw something sacred. The return of integrity to an institution long shrouded in shadows. The media moved swiftly, not to criticize, but to anoint. Op-eds began to appear, declaring her the People's Princess Reborn. It wasn't just a callback to Diana, it was a rebirth of the values she once stood for. Compassion without performance. Strength without control. Leadership that didn't depend on status, but on soul. Charlotte had become the face of a new era, and it wasn't one orchestrated behind the scenes. It was born in front of the world, in real time, with every word she'd spoken and every silence she'd refused to keep. And then, something extraordinary happened. The phrase began to spread not just in headlines or hashtags, but in whispers, in conversations, in awe. Did you hear what she told Camilla? It didn't matter who you were. That line, passed from voice to voice, carried with it a sense of poetic justice, of unspoken vindication. It became more than gossip. It became folklore. In that one photo, a monarchy that had once seemed impervious to emotion looked more human than ever. It wasn't the pomp or the titles that struck a chord. It was the simple image of a girl who dared to speak. And in doing so, she gave the nation a new story. One not written by the palace, but by history itself. The monarchy may never be the same, but one thing is clear. The future found its voice in the most unexpected soul. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.